the woman he never bothered to know. The morning it happened, the conference room felt completely ordinary. Cold coffee, pale fluorescent light, the low hum of Washington waking up outside the window. My assistant had already placed a stack of folders on my desk before I even removed my coat, and I moved through them the way I always did. Efficiently, without ceremony, the way 35 years of naval service had trained me to process everything. Then I reached the file near the bottom of the stack. I picked it up, read the name printed across the cover, set it down, picked it up again. My stomach dropped so fast, I actually pressed one hand flat against the desk to steady myself. Commander Daniel Hargrove, United States Navy. My husband's son. The young man who had spent the past 3 years telling anyone who would listen that I had married his father for financial security. The same young man who had raised a champagne flute at a birthday dinner 2 summers ago and suggested, with a grin he probably thought was charming, that some women marry for love while others marry for waterfront real estate. The same young man who had never once, in 3 years of family dinners and holiday gatherings and awkward Sunday lunches, thought to ask a single genuine question about who I was or what I had spent my life doing. His personnel file now sat less than 3 feet from my right hand. Inside it were allegations serious enough to trigger a formal review. The kind of review that, if the findings held, could permanently alter the trajectory of a promising military career. No one around the conference table knew the connection. No one knew that the officer under scrutiny was my stepson. No one knew that for 3 years I had smiled through his insults at family gatherings while carrying classified briefings in my other hand. And no one knew that the most difficult battle of my professional life wasn't unfolding on some foreign coastline. It was unfolding inside my own chest. Because I wasn't simply his stepmother. I was the Navy Inspector General. And the regulations that had anchored my entire career demanded exactly one thing from me in that moment. Absolute fairness. No favoritism, no score settling, no exceptions, not for strangers, not for enemies, not for family. I stared at the file. Then I opened it. And for the first time in 35 years of service, I genuinely wasn't sure whether my training or my humanity would win. My name is Victoria Hargrove. I'm 58 years old. For 3.5 decades, I wore a United States Navy uniform. Most people who encounter me outside of a professional context never suspect it. I've come to prefer that. After a career built on inspections, investigations, and the weight of institutional authority, I find that anonymity is one of life's most underrated pleasures. 3 years before Daniel's file appeared on my desk, I married a man named Gerald Hargrove. Gerald was 62, a quietly successful civil engineer from coastal Virginia who had spent decades building infrastructure that most people used without ever thinking about. He was also a widower. His wife, Caroline, had passed away after a long and painful illness, and by the time our paths crossed at a policy conference in Washington, both of us had lived enough life to know exactly what we were looking for. Not excitement, not drama, not the kind of love that announces itself loudly. Peace, companionship, someone to share the quiet. We moved slowly. Coffee became lunch. Lunch became long walks. Long walks became conversations that stretched past midnight. Eventually, without either of us quite planning it, those conversations became something neither of us had expected to find again. Gerald proposed on an October evening overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. No audience, no staged moment, just an honest man asking an honest question. That's probably why I said yes. The only complication was his son. Daniel was 29 when I first met him. Tall, naturally commanding, the kind of presence that fills a room without trying. He'd graduated near the top of his class at the Naval Academy and had spent the years since building a reputation that impressed even senior officers who didn't impress easily. His father adored him, and from everything Gerald had told me, I fully expected to like him. I was wrong. The first meeting happened at Gerald's home in Virginia Beach. Daniel arrived precisely on time, a military habit, and greeted me with a handshake that communicated exactly nothing. His smile was practiced. His questions were polite in the way that questions can be polite without being warm. "What do you do, Victoria?" "I work for the Navy." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "In what capacity?" "Administrative oversight." Technically accurate, radically incomplete. He nodded and turned toward his father, and something shifted in his expression, something I didn't have the full context to read yet. Something that, whoa. I'll take 3 years to fully understand. The wedding was small. Gerald wanted simplicity, so did I, yet before the honeymoon had ended, the whispers reached me, not from strangers, from Daniel. At first, it filtered through relatives. An aunt who changed the subject too quickly, a cousin who looked uncomfortable at a passing comment, a family friend whose eyes communicated apology. Eventually, the picture assembled itself. Daniel believed I had married his father for money. The accusation would have been funny if it weren't so persistent. My military pension alone placed me comfortably above the median American household income. I owned my home outright. My investments were stable, the product of decades of disciplined service in which I had neither the time nor the inclination to spend extravagantly. I had earned every dollar I possessed, and I had done it in uniform, on deployments, in command structures that demanded everything and apologized for nothing. But Daniel didn't know any of that, and more importantly, he had never tried to find out. Gerald wanted to confront him. Many times, many conversations, I wouldn't allow it. "He's grieving, I'd say." "Victoria, it has been years." "Grief doesn't run on a calendar, Gerald." He'd shake his head. "You give him too much grace." Maybe I did. Or maybe 3 decades in the Navy had taught me something about patience, something about the gap between what people appear to be and what they're actually carrying. I held on to hope for a while. I hoped Daniel would eventually grow curious, that he'd ask a question that mattered, that some small moment would crack open the assumption he'd built around me. Instead, things escalated. Family barbecues became exercises in endurance. Holiday tables became quiet minefields. He had a gift for the disguised insult, the kind wrapped in humor so that objecting to it made you seem humorless. One Thanksgiving he asked whether retirement had been treating me well. When I told him I wasn't retired, he laughed and said it must be nice not to need to work. Several people found somewhere else to look. I passed the cranberry sauce. The real turning point came at Gerald's 65th birthday dinner. 40 guests, a waterfront restaurant in Norfolk. The kind of evening that should have been nothing but warmth and laughter. It was, until Daniel had too much to drink and decided that what the room needed was a toast. He tapped his glass, the room quieted. He began with his father's stories from childhood, old football games, the kind of memories that make people lean forward and smile. Then his eyes found me across the table. And then he said it. "Some women marry for love." A few polite chuckles, others marry for waterfront property. The silence that followed was complete. I heard a fork touch a plate on the far side of the room. Gerald's face went red so quickly I worried for his blood pressure. Several guests looked mortified. Daniel seemed satisfied with himself, as though he'd finally said what everyone had been privately thinking. They hadn't been, only he had. I raised my glass, took a small sip, and smiled. Nothing more. Later that night, Gerald apologized on his son's behalf. I told him it wasn't necessary. Then I told him something I genuinely believed. He'll understand eventually. Gerald studied me for a moment. "You still think that?" "I do." He shook his head slowly. "You're a better person than I am." Maybe, or maybe I had simply learned, over decades of leading people under pressure, that the most effective response to someone's worst behavior is occasionally to simply refuse to become what they believe you to be. The file that changed everything. About 6 months after Gerald's birthday dinner, a Navy leadership conference brought me to Arlington. The kind of event where large ballrooms fill with officers, civilian officials, and contractors, and everyone spends half the day talking about leadership principles and the other half in line for coffee. I was reviewing materials when I heard a familiar voice across the room. "Daniel." I observed him for a moment, not as his stepmother, but as a senior officer assessing a colleague, and what I saw was genuinely impressive. He was relaxed, engaged, commanding without effort. His reputation within the fleet was strong. His performance evaluations consistently described him as exceptional. Several senior officers had mentioned his name as someone with flag officer potential, and that is not a distinction distributed casually in the United States Navy. The competition is extraordinary. He noticed me. His expression shifted, not hostile, just that familiar discomfort. He crossed the room. Victoria, didn't realize you'd be here. I work for the Navy, remember. A polite chuckle, the irony sailed completely past him. We exchanged a few harmless sentences. Then he returned to his colleagues. And as I watched him go, I remember thinking something unexpected, if he ever stopped judging people before understanding them, he would be genuinely unstoppable. Meanwhile, the Navy's oversight machinery was doing what it always does, quietly, methodically, without announcement. It began with small things, a complaint here, an observation there, the kind of low-level concerns that surface in large organizations constantly and are resolved without incident 9 times out of 10. The first one connected to Daniel's command never even reached my desk. It was reviewed at a lower level. No findings, no action, file closed. Then a second concern appeared. A few months later, a third. None were dramatic. None were criminal. But something about the constellation of them, the consistency across different locations, different personnel, different time periods, made experienced investigators pause. A commander who seemed to operate differently when no one senior was watching. A leader who expected to be exempt from the same standards he enforced downward. An officer who struggled to accept that criticism might occasionally be correct. One afternoon, Captain Rebecca Torres, one of the most perceptive investigators I'd ever worked with, stopped by my office with a folder. "Interesting pattern developing," she said. I looked at the paperwork. A cluster of leadership concerns, geographically spread, temporally scattered. The names meant nothing to me. "What's your concern?" I asked. "Nothing I can quantify yet." "That's not an answer." She smiled. "It's a professional instinct." After 35 years in uniform, I understood exactly what she meant. The Monday morning it happened was unremarkable in every way. Cold outside, gray sky, coffee from the same cafe I'd visited for years, routine briefings, routine schedule. Until I reached the file in the center of my desk. I read the name once, then again, then a third time as though repetition might change the letters. Commander Daniel Hargrove. My stepson. For several seconds I simply sat there, while the city hummed outside the window, and the coffee grew cold in my hand. Then I opened the file. And I understood immediately that this was no longer a family matter. This was a Navy matter now. The weight of fairness. The hardest decisions aren't the ones where you don't know what's right. They're the ones where you know exactly what's right, and every human instinct inside you is pushing toward something else. Within the hour, I contacted legal counsel. Full disclosure, complete transparency. The moment a personal connection exists in an oversight matter, it must be documented, reviewed, and properly managed. I informed the appropriate officials that Commander Daniel Hargrove was my stepson. Everything was recorded. Everything was examined. The attorneys determined that given the multiple independent layers between my office and any final personnel decision, I could remain involved in the preliminary oversight process. But they were unambiguous about one thing. Absolute objectivity, no preferential treatment in either direction, no retaliation, no protection, no exceptions. Exactly what I would have demanded from anyone else. I sat alone for a while after that call, looking out at Washington and thinking about what was coming, about Gerald, about Daniel, about the family dinners that suddenly felt like they belonged to a different chapter of my life. The initial allegations were, on their surface, relatively manageable. Questions about leadership culture, concerns about judgment, potential misuse of supervisory authority, nothing criminal, nothing that would make headlines, but enough to justify a careful, thorough examination. I spent the following weeks doing what investigations actually require, which bears almost no resemblance to how they appear in films. Thousands of pages of reports, personnel evaluations, travel records, command climate surveys, interview summaries. The painstaking, unglamorous work of following facts wherever they lead, without destination in mind. The first thing the evidence confirmed was that Daniel's strengths were genuine. His performance evaluations were consistently outstanding. His mission results were impressive. Even several of the people who had filed concerns acknowledged that he was remarkably talented at the operational dimensions of his role. A fair investigation accounts for both sides of a person, and the record showed clearly that Daniel Hargrove was, in many respects, an exceptional officer. The second thing the evidence showed was more troubling. Across different commands, different years, different personnel, the same pattern repeated. A commander who believed his judgment was inherently superior to the people around him. A leader who resisted feedback not because the feedback was wrong, but because receiving it felt beneath him. An officer who applied standards differently to himself than to others, not dramatically, not obviously, just enough that people noticed, just enough that people remembered. Cultural problem. MS are insidious precisely because they don't look like problems from the inside. They look like confidence. They look like standards. They look like leadership. Only from the outside, from the people being led, does the distinction between strength and arrogance become visible. Rebecca Torres came back to my office one afternoon with another stack of documents and an expression I recognized. "Travel authorizations," she said, setting the folder on my desk. I scanned the summary. A hotel upgrade here, an unusual approval routing there, a reimbursement that required additional context. Individually, each item was defensible. Collectively, they described something more concerning, a pattern of someone growing gradually more comfortable bending the boundaries of what was permissible. That's how these things almost always begin. Not with a dramatic decision to break the rules, but with a small decision to bend one, followed by the gradual normalization of bending that makes the next bend easier and the one after that easier still. The boundaries don't disappear. They just move quietly, incrementally, until the person inside them no longer remembers where they started. "How are you holding up?" Rebecca asked. "Professionally, fine." I meant personally. I looked down at the folder. "That's more complicated." She nodded. She'd served long enough to understand that some cases aren't the most severe ones and still manage to be the most difficult. Gerald called that evening. I sat in my office and listened to him talk about a neighbor's new boat and a fishing trip he was planning and ordinary things that felt very far away. I said the right words. I asked the right questions, all the while knowing what I couldn't share, carrying the weight of information that would eventually reach this family and change the atmosphere of it permanently. The burden of confidentiality is one of those things that doesn't get discussed much in leadership conversations, but it's real and it's heavy. The testimony that changed everything. About 4 weeks into the formal review, a call came on a Thursday afternoon from the senior investigator, and I knew from the first 2 seconds of his voice that something significant had shifted. "We received additional testimony," he said. I set down my pen. "What kind?" A witness came forward voluntarily, regarding potential retaliation against a subordinate who reported concerns. I closed my eyes. Retaliation is not a leadership deficiency. It is not a judgment error. It is not a cultural problem that can be coached away in a development program. Retaliation is an assault on the foundation of institutional accountability. It tells everyone watching that honesty has consequences, that speaking up is dangerous, that the safest thing to do is stay quiet and comply. Silence is how organizations fail. Silence is how people get hurt. And if Daniel had deliberately moved against someone for telling the truth, the consequences would be severe. Appropriately severe. The investigator described the evidence. A junior lieutenant who had raised legitimate concerns about several decisions under Daniel's command. Nothing dramatic, nothing criminal, just concerns expressed through proper channels. Shortly afterward, that lieutenant's assignments had changed. Opportunities had diminished. The timing was not explainable by coincidence. When the call ended, I sat in the fading light of my office for a long time. I felt something I hadn't expected. Fear for him. Not for myself, for Daniel. Because a witness had provided credible testimony, and credible testimony in a retaliation investigation is the kind of thing that ends careers. The review board convened the following week. More interviews, additional testimony, careful analysis of documentation and timelines. The process moved deliberately. The Navy is thorough precisely because it understands that careers and reputations are serious things, not to be damaged carelessly. What emerged was not a single catastrophic act, but something more complex, and in some ways more important: the accumulated record of 100 small decisions. 100 moments when humility should have prevailed and didn't. 100 opportunities to listen that were dismissed in favor of certainty. Leadership failures rarely arrive complete. They assemble themselves across time, invisible until suddenly they aren't. The board's preliminary conclusion was clear. Formal administrative action was warranted. Daniel's promotion consideration would be suspended pending final review. Corrective measures would be required. For the first time, his future was genuinely uncertain. 3 days later, the information reached him. Not the details, not the full record, just enough to tell him that serious questions had emerged and that the answers being sought came from inside a process he hadn't known was happening. By several accounts, his initial reaction moved through disbelief, then anger, then the kind of determined, resource-gathering that successful people default to when confronted by situations they weren't expecting. He requested documentation. He requested meetings. He engaged legal counsel. Every right he had, he exercised. The system exists for that purpose. But something else was also happening beneath the surface. The certainty he had always carried, the bedrock confidence of a man whose talent had consistently protected him from serious consequences, was developing cracks. The visitor without an appointment. I was reviewing reports one afternoon when my assistant appeared in the doorway. "You have a visitor." Her hesitation told me everything. "Daniel." No appointment. No advance notice. Just my stepson standing outside my office because the investigation had finally revealed enough that he could no longer pretend not to see the shape of it. "Send him in." He entered. The confidence was still there. It was structural at this point, built into the way he moved, but something had joined it. A tightness around the eyes. A quality of attention that wasn't usually present when he looked at me. "Victoria." "Daniel." Neither of us moved for a moment. "I have a question," he said. I gestured to a chair. He sat slowly, leaned forward, and then asked, for the first time in 3 years of shared family life, the question he had never thought to ask. "What exactly do you do for the Navy?" I almost smiled. 3 years. Every holiday, every birthday, every Sunday lunch, and only now, with his career under formal examination, had he grown curious enough to ask. I chose my words with care. "My position isn't relevant to your situation." "It is to me." The frustration in his voice was real, but beneath it was something more interesting: confusion. The confusion of a man whose fixed image of another person has suddenly become incompatible with observable reality. "Daniel," I kept my voice even, "you should focus on the process in front of you." He stared at me for a moment. Then he stood without another word and left. The answer came the following week, not from me but from official documentation he reviewed as part of standard administrative procedures. Organizational charts, reporting structures, titles, names, the kind of facts that don't negotiate with what someone has chosen to believe. Gerald called that evening. His voice had a quality I recognized, not upset exactly, but genuinely stunned. "He came to the house," Gerald said. "He thought there must be some mistake." "There wasn't a mistake. He keeps asking why no one told him." I looked out at the Washington skyline in the evening dark and thought about that question. Why hadn't anyone told him? Nobody had hidden it. Not once. It simply had never occurred to Daniel to ask, because he had decided what I was before he knew anything about me, and once a person decides that, information becomes the enemy of the story they've already written. The meeting that wasn't about the Navy. He asked to meet at the house, rather than the office. I understood the request. Whatever was about to happen between us didn't belong to the Navy. It belonged to a kitchen table and a bay view and the ordinary afternoon light of people who are finally going to stop pretending. Gerald was visiting a friend in North Carolina. The house was quiet. The Chesapeake shimmered through the back windows. A warm afternoon breeze moved the curtains. Under different circumstances, it would have been a perfect day. I was nervous, genuinely nervous, which surprised me because I had informed families of casualties, delivered career-ending findings to senior officers, briefed members of Congress, and sat across tables from people who held institutional power over my own future. None of that had made me nervous the way a 31-year-old man's knock on my door did. The bell rang at exactly 2 o'clock. Of course it did. I opened the door. He looked older than I had seen him look before. Not older in years, in weight. The previous weeks had settled into his face in a way that the previous 3 years of success had never touched him. The confidence was still present, but it had made room for something it had never allowed before. Humility. Hi, Victoria. Hi, Daniel, come in. We sat at the kitchen table. I poured coffee. He thanked me genuinely, without ceremony. Small talk lasted approximately 45 seconds. Then the silence settled, and he let it sit for a moment before speaking. I owe you an apology. I waited. He looked down at his coffee. Several seconds passed. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. I've treated you badly. Direct, unqualified. No, if you took it that way, attached. No, I'm sorry you felt. Just the plain acknowledgement of a plain fact. I stayed quiet. Not to make him suffer, because some truths need room to breathe, and filling that room too quickly is a kindness that doesn't serve anyone. He continued, I convinced Mize. LF, you married Gerald for money. I know. I said that to other people. I know that too. His jaw tightened, the visible evidence of shame in a person who had not had much recent practice with it. The worst part, he said, is that I never had a single piece of evidence, not one. I didn't answer, because he was right and he knew it. Everything had been assumption. Everything had been the projection of a story onto a person he had never actually looked at. He had needed me to be something specific, and so he had made me that thing and then spent 3 years defending the making. The clock in the living room ticked. A boat passed somewhere out on the water. Can I ask you something? He said eventually. Of course. Why didn't you tell me who you were? I looked at him steadily. What exactly should I have told you? Your career, your background, everything. Daniel, I never hid any of it. But you never. You never asked. I let that land without softness. Not once. Not about where I served. Not about what I'd done. Not about what any of those years actually looked like. You formed a conclusion before we exchanged 50 words, and after that, nothing I said or did was ever going to compete with the conclusion you'd already reached. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. Heavier, more honest. You're right, he said finally. 3 years of family dinners. 3 years of disguised jabs and waterfront jokes and champagne toasts in front of 40 witnesses. And now, at a kitchen table on an ordinary afternoon, the first 2 words he'd ever said to me that actually cost him something. I told him things I had never volunteered before because no one had ever asked. I told him about growing up in rural Ohio, in a town where the options were narrow, and the expectations for girls were narrower still. I told him about joining the Navy at 18 because I wanted something larger than what I could see, about the years of discipline and sacrifice, and hard work that nobody celebrates, because it happens in increments too small to notice, until you look back across 35 years and see the whole arc of it. I told him about deployments, about missing years of ordinary life in exchange for something I believed in, about the price of service that most people only see the surface of. He listened. Really listened. Not waiting for his turn, not mentally composing a response. Just listening, the way people do when they've finally run out of the certainty that was making listening unnecessary. I watched the image he'd carried of me, the comfortable retiree, the strategic social climber, the woman angling for a soft landing, come apart piece by piece. Were you angry? He asked eventually. Sometimes. Why didn't you ever say anything? I almost laughed. Because argument wouldn't have changed your mind. You weren't looking for information, Daniel. You were looking for confirmation. There's a difference, and you can't argue someone out of a position they didn't argue themselves into. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I think I resented you before I even met you. I know. Because you weren't her. And there it was, the thing beneath all the other things. The wound that had been generating every jab, every assumption, every champagne glass lifted at the wrong moment. His mother. He continued slowly, as though the words were being retrieved from somewhere he hadn't accessed in years. When Gerald had begun seeing someone, Daniel had felt guilty. Not angry, guilty. As though Gerald moving forward meant Caroline was being left behind. As though accepting me meant forgetting her. Everything rearranged itself, in my understanding. The money accusation had never been about money. Money had simply been the shape available when he needed something to push against. The real thing underneath it was grief. Unprocessed, unaddressed, years-old grief that had been looking for somewhere to go. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. He looked up, startled by the gesture. Your mother would want you to be happy, I said, both of you. He looked away immediately. His eyes filled so fast it clearly caught him off guard, and he spent a moment in the complicated internal negotiation that people do when emotion surprises them in company. When he looked back, something had shifted, something fundamental. What second chances actually cost? The sun was low by the time Daniel stood to leave. The afternoon had given way to early evening, and the bay outside held the orange and gold that Virginia autumn can produce on its best days. At the door he stopped. I have one more question. I waited. His voice was quieter than I'd heard it all afternoon. Do you think I deserve a second chance? The question hung between us. I looked at him for a long moment. This complicated, talented, flawed young man who had spent 3 years misunderstanding me and had spent one afternoon beginning to undo it, and I thought carefully about how to answer. Daniel, I think everyone deserves a second chance. The relief that crossed his face was immediate. Then I finished the sentence. But not everyone is willing to do the work required to earn one. The relief didn't disappear. It grew more serious, which is actually the better version of it. He nodded slowly. I understand. For the first time, I believed he did. After he left, I sat alone on the back deck and watched the light fail over the water. The sky over the Chesapeake turned deep amber, then rose, then the particular dark blue that arrives just before evening. The water held the reflection of it all. I sat there for a long time without thinking about anything specific, just breathing, just letting the day settle. There is a particular kind of peace that arrives after prolonged pretending stops. Not happiness exactly, not even relief exactly, just the solid, uncomplicated weight of reality after all the energy that was going into managing a fiction has been released. For 3 years, Daniel had been in conflict with a version of me that had never existed. And I had spent 3 years watching him fight that phantom, absorbing the consequences without arguing back, waiting for curiosity to replace assumption. Now the phantom was gone. And whatever came next, at least it would be real. Epilogue: what growth actually looks like. The months that followed the investigation's conclusion were not easy. They weren't supposed to be. The administrative findings remained in Daniel's record. His promotion was suspended. His command responsibilities were adjusted. He was required to complete a formal leadership development program monitored by senior officers who had seen similar cases resolve in both directions. Some people expected him to resign. Others expected his career to effectively be finished. Neither happened. What happened instead was something quieter and more significant. He changed. Not instantly, not dramatically, not in any single moment that could be pointed to and called a turning point. Gradually, over months, the officers around him began noticing something different. He listened in meetings rather than waiting for his turn to direct. He solicited feedback from people below him rather than treating their silence as agreement. When he was wrong, and he was sometimes wrong, as everyone is, he said so without the defensive maneuvering that had previously characterized those moments. A commander who had known him for years called me one afternoon. I could hear something cautious in his voice, as though he wasn't entirely sure whether the thing he'd observed was real. "He seems different," the commander said. "Different how?" A pause, humbler. "Honestly, Victoria, he's becoming a better leader." I thanked him and ended the call. Then I sat quietly for a while with something I hadn't expected to feel about this situation. Pride. Not because Daniel had recovered, because he had chosen to change. Those are genuinely different things, and the difference is everything. Gerald noticed it too, gradually, at family gatherings that had lost the specific tension that had made them feel like performances for years. Conversations moved more freely. Silences were comfortable rather than loaded. The particular vigilance that everyone had been maintaining without quite admitting it, the constant low-level scanning for the next jab, the next assumption dressed as a joke, dissipated. One evening Gerald and I were walking along the beach. Autumn air, the smell of salt, the sound of the water behaving the way it always does, indifferent to all the human drama happening in its vicinity. Gerald took my hand. "I almost stopped believing," he said. "In what?" "That this would work, you and Daniel." I watched the water. There were moments when I did too. "But you never showed it." "I had practice." He was quiet for a while. "You know what I think now." "What?" "I think he needed to do this the hard way. I think if I'd forced a conversation early on, if I'd sat him down and delivered a speech, it wouldn't have taken. He needed to arrive here himself." I didn't say anything, but I thought he was probably right. The convictions people reach through pressure usually last only as long as the pressure does. The convictions people reach through experience, through consequence, through the slow collision of their assumptions with reality, those tend to stick. The following summer, Gerald hosted a backyard gathering. Nothing elaborate. Burgers, cold drinks, neighbors and relatives drifting in and out through a warm afternoon. The ordinary architecture of family life in its most uncomplicated form. I was carrying a platter of food to a folding table when I heard Daniel's voice nearby. He was speaking with several relatives, relaxed, easy in the way he was when he wasn't performing anything. One of Gerald's cousins, who had heard my name but didn't know my background, as Ked, how I seemed to know so much about military leadership culture. Before I could respond, Daniel did. "My stepmother served this country for 35 years. The surrounding conversation dipped slightly. He continued, holding his plate, completely at ease with what he was saying. "She's one of the finest officers I've encountered in my career." Nobody made much of it. Conversation resumed. The afternoon continued. But I stood still for a moment longer than necessary. Not because of the compliment. The compliment was generous and I appreciated it, but compliments are easy things to manufacture. What stopped me was something smaller and more significant. My stepmother. Not Gerald's wife. Not Victoria. Not a careful, arm's-length formulation designed to acknowledge my presence without claiming relationship. My stepmother. Family. The word did the work that 3 years of family dinners, holiday gatherings, uncomfortable toasts, and patient silence had never quite managed to do. Later that evening, after the neighbors had drifted home and the light had gone soft, 4 of us were left on the back porch. Gerald, Daniel, Daniel's wife Lauren, me. The conversation found its own pace, old stories, future plans, the comfortable shapelessness of people who no longer need to perform for each other. At one point, Daniel looked at me across the table. I owe you more than an apology, he said. You don't owe me anything. After everything Daniel, I kept my voice quiet. This was never about what you owed me, this was about what you owed yourself. He looked at me for a moment. Then, slowly, understanding moved across his face. Because that was the truth of it. The real battle had never been between the two of us. It had been between Daniel and the assumptions he was carrying. Between Daniel and the grief he hadn't finished feeling. Between Daniel and the version of himself that needed someone to blame for a loss he hadn't known how to absorb. Once those things were addressed, honestly, painfully, at real cost, everything else had simply become possible. I look back on this now from the distance of time, and what strikes me most is how ordinary all the components were. A man who lost his mother too young. A son who couldn't separate a father's remarriage from an erasure of the past. A woman who carried decades of service invisibly, the way most people carry the things they've earned. A file that arrived on a desk at exactly the wrong moment. Or exactly the right one. This was never a story about revenge. I want to be clear about that, because people often hear the shape of it and assume it is. Nobody was humiliated publicly. Nobody was destroyed. Nobody lost everything in a single, satisfying moment of cosmic justice. What happened was slower and more substantial than that. A person looked honestly at what he had become and chose to become something better. That doesn't make for a particularly dramatic story, but in my experience, it's the most meaningful outcome there is. More meaningful than watching someone fall. Far more meaningful than being the one who pushed. Because here is what 35 years in uniform taught me about the people who hurt us. They are almost always carrying something they haven't shown anyone. That doesn't excuse the harm they cause. It doesn't make the harm smaller or the patience required to absorb it less real. But understanding that wound, seeing it for what it is, can sometimes accomplish in a single afternoon what years of argument never could. Daniel's assumptions about me were never really about me. They were about Caroline, about loss, about a young man who needed a target for grief and chose the nearest available one. When I understood that, the anger I might have held dissolved into something more useful. Compassion, and the quiet decision to wait. If you've stayed with me through all of this, perhaps there's someone in your own life who carries a fixed idea about you that has nothing to do with who you actually are. Or perhaps you're carrying one about someone else. Perhaps the question worth asking, before the next assumption, before the next conclusion drawn from insufficient information, is simply, what don't I know about this person yet? You might be surprised by what that question opens up. Growth is possible at any age, for anyone willing to bear the discomfort of being wrong. That might be the most important thing this story has to offer. And if it reached you in some way, I hope you'll carry it forward. Because stories about second chances and the people willing to earn them are, I think, some of the most necessary ones we have.